His aging war dog refused to leave a $1 apothecary until a hidden bunker exposed a dead soldier's secret. Snow buried the Montana mountains. The night Garrett Boone rolled into Black Hollow with $1, a dying truck, and an old military K9 named Atlas. The abandoned apothecary at the end of the street looked ready to collapse. But Atlas wouldn't leave the porch. Hours later, Garrett discovered a hidden steel door beneath an ancient cabinet, and the truth waiting below would change everything he believed about his father, war, and why the dog led him there. Comment 1 if you'd follow your dog no matter where it led you, or 0 if you think Garrett should have walked away. And tell us where you're watching from. The snow had started before sunset and had not stopped for 6 straight hours. By midnight, western Montana looked less like a place people lived, and more like a forgotten white wilderness, swallowed by wind and darkness. The 2-lane highway cutting through the mountains had nearly disappeared beneath drifting snow, and the only thing moving across that frozen landscape was an old, rust-colored Ford pickup crawling north through the storm. Its headlights shook against the blowing snow. Its engine sounded tired. Inside the cab, Garrett Boone gripped the steering wheel with rough, cracked hands that still carried faint scars from another lifetime. At 54 years old, Garrett looked older than his years. Hard years had carved deep lines beside his eyes and mouth. His dark beard had turned mostly gray now, and the skin around his knuckles looked weathered like old leather, left too long in the sun. Beside him sat Atlas. The German shepherd's muzzle had gone white with age, but his posture remained alert despite the stiffness in his hips. A faded military harness still wrapped around his broad chest. The patch sewn onto the side had nearly worn away, but the words could still be read beneath the scratches. U.S. Navy K9 unit. Atlas stared through the windshield without blinking, ears twitching slightly whenever the wind slammed against the truck. Garrett reached over and rubbed the dog gently behind the neck. "You still with me, old man?" Atlas gave a low grunt without taking his eyes off the road. That answer was enough. The heater barely worked anymore. Thin, cold air leaked through the cracked door seals, carrying the smell of snow and pine into the cab. Garrett adjusted the blanket draped across Atlas's back before glancing at the gas gauge. Less than a quarter tank, he sighed quietly. 3 months earlier, he had been sleeping in a motel outside Spokane. 2 months earlier, he had been living behind a closed lumber yard in Idaho. Before that, there had been shelters, truck stops, campgrounds, and abandoned parking lots scattered across the northern Rockies. Now there was only the truck and Atlas. Everything else was gone. Garrett had once owned a house outside Virginia Beach. He had once worn dress whites at military ceremonies, once had neighbors, once had a wife laughing too loud during movies and sang Patsy Cline songs while cooking breakfast on Sunday mornings. Her name had been Nora. The memory hit him the way it always did now, sudden and sharp enough to steal the air from his lungs. He tightened his grip on the wheel. "Don't, not tonight." Outside, the storm worsened. Snow spun across the highway in violent waves. Pine trees bent beneath the wind like black skeletal figures bowing toward the earth. Then Atlas lifted his head. The dog's ears moved forward. Garrett noticed immediately. After years together overseas, he had learned to trust every shift in Atlas's behavior. "What is it?" Atlas stared ahead. A faint glow appeared through the storm. Town lights, small ones. Garrett slowed as a weather-beaten wooden sign emerged from the snow along the roadside. Black Hollow population 612. The town looked half asleep beneath the storm. A gas station stood dark beside the highway. A diner with frosted windows glowed weakly near the railroad tracks. Beyond it sat rows of old buildings with snow-covered roofs and faded storefront signs from another era. Garrett drove slowly down the empty main street. Most places were closed. A few yellow lights flickered behind curtains upstairs. The storm had buried everything in silence. Then the truck coughed violently. Garrett frowned. The engine sputtered once, twice, then steadied again. "Come on," he muttered softly. "Not tonight." Atlas shifted beside him. Garrett spotted a narrow side street and turned down it, searching for somewhere sheltered from the wind. Snow crunched beneath the tires as the truck rolled between old brick buildings and weathered wooden storefronts. Then Atlas suddenly stood upright. A deep growl rumbled inside his chest. Garrett hit the brakes. "What?" Atlas was staring through the passenger window. Garrett followed his gaze. At first he saw nothing but darkness and snow. Then lightning flashed somewhere beyond the mountains. For half a second, the entire street lit silver-white, and Garrett saw it. An old two-story building, sitting alone at the far end of the block. The faded wooden sign above the porch barely remained attached. Black Hollow Apothecary. The windows were dark. The roof sagged slightly beneath heavy snow. A county foreclosure notice hung crooked beside the front door. Garrett frowned. Atlas whined softly. Not fear, recognition. The dog pushed his nose against the glass. Garrett felt a strange chill crawl up the back of his neck. "You know this place?" "Impossible." Atlas had never been here. Garrett parked along the curb and shut off the engine. The silence afterward felt enormous. Wind howled between the buildings. Atlas immediately climbed over the center console and pawed at the passenger door. All right. Garrett opened it. The dog jumped down into the snow, despite his limp, and moved directly toward the apothecary porch. Not wandering, not sniffing randomly, walking with purpose. Garrett pulled his coat tighter and followed. Snowflakes struck his face like ice needles as he climbed the wooden porch steps. The old boards groaned beneath his boots. Atlas stood perfectly still before the front door. His amber eyes never moved. Garrett noticed the county notice nailed beside the entrance. Property seized for back taxes, available for county transfer. Inquire at municipal office. Below that, someone had scribbled in faded black marker, $1 property release program. Garrett stared at it. $1. He almost laughed. After everything life had taken from him, after all the years of service and loss and debt and hospitals and funerals, the universe had apparently decided to leave him standing in front of a collapsing apothecary during a snowstorm, with exactly $1 remaining in his wallet. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the wrinkled bill. $1. His last one. Atlas stepped closer to the door. Then something strange happened. The dog slowly sat down and refused to move. Garrett frowned. Atlas. Nothing. The shepherd remained frozen, staring directly at the dark entrance. Wind swirled snow across the porch. Garrett moved beside him and rested a hand on the dog's shoulder. That was when he noticed Atlas trembling slightly. Not from cold, from focus. The same focus Garrett had seen overseas before Atlas detected hidden explosives or enemies buried beneath rubble. Every instinct inside Garrett suddenly sharpened. He looked at the building again. The faded windows, the dark upper floor, the heavy silence. For a brief second he felt something impossible. Not fear, expectation, as though the building itself had been waiting. Atlas let out a low whine. Garrett crouched beside him. "What do you hear?" The dog's ears twitched toward the darkness inside. Garrett listened carefully. Nothing, only wind, only snow. And yet, something about the place felt alive beneath the silence. A single porch light flickered weakly across the street, casting pale gold over the snow-covered sidewalk. Garrett looked back toward town. No movement, no cars, no people watching from windows. Just the storm. He looked down at the $1 bill still in his hand, then back at the building. Atlas did not blink once. Garrett exhaled slowly. "Well," he whispered to the dog, "looks like we found somewhere to die." But even as he said it, something deep inside him, something that had been dead a long time, shifted quietly awake. And Atlas kept staring at the door, like he already knew what waited behind it. The storm raged harder around them. Snow slammed sideways across Mill Street, rattling the loose shutters of abandoned buildings farther down the block. Somewhere in the darkness, a metal sign creaked back and forth in the wind with a slow, mournful groan. Garrett finally touched Atlas gently on the shoulder. "Come on, boy. We're freezing." The German shepherd didn't move. Garrett frowned. That alone was unusual. Atlas had obeyed him under gunfire, mortar blasts, helicopter rotors, and collapsing concrete overseas. The dog had once dragged Garrett 20 feet across shattered rock in Afghanistan after an ambush buried half their team beneath a mud wall. Atlas listened, always, but now the dog sat perfectly rigid before the apothecary door. Garrett looked up at the faded sign again. Black Hollow Apothecary. Most of the gold paint had peeled away decades earlier. Snow had gathered thickly along the porch railings, and the upper windows were dark beneath layers of dust. Yet the building itself seemed stubbornly alive somehow, standing against the storm long after everything around it had begun to decay. Garrett stepped closer to the entrance. The old glass door had warped inside its frame. A heavy brass handle sat beneath years of tarnish. Beside it hung another county notice nearly buried beneath snow. Property available through County Historical Preservation Initiative. He stared at those words for several seconds. Historical preservation. That explained the dollar price. No sane investor wanted a collapsing antique in the middle of nowhere. A gust of wind tore down the street so violently it nearly knocked Garrett sideways. Atlas finally stood and pressed against Garrett's leg protectively. "All right," Garrett muttered. "Truck first." This time the dog followed, reluctantly. Garrett climbed back into the pickup and slammed the door shut against the storm. The cab instantly fogged with cold breath. He started the engine again, and the truck groaned in protest before sputtering to life. The gas needle dropped lower, almost empty now. Garrett leaned back against the torn seat and closed his eyes briefly. He needed sleep, real sleep. Not the kind you got in parking lots, with one hand near a pistol beneath your coat. Not the kind interrupted every 20 minutes by memories. Atlas settled beside him, but kept glancing toward the building through the frosted passenger window. Garrett noticed. "You really don't like this place, huh?" Atlas gave a soft, low whine. Garrett studied the dog quietly. There had been moments overseas when Atlas sensed danger long before any human did. Hidden explosives, ambush positions, collapsed tunnels with survivors trapped beneath debris. The handlers used to joke that Atlas could smell fear through concrete. Garrett trusted him more than he trusted most people, which was exactly why the dog's behavior bothered him now. Because this wasn't fear. It was attention, focused attention. Like Atlas had found something unfinished. Garrett rubbed tired eyes and looked toward the clock on the dashboard. 12:43 a.m. No motel lights. No open businesses. Nothing except snow and darkness. Then Atlas suddenly lifted his head again. Headlights approached through the storm. A pickup rolled slowly around the corner and stopped across from the apothecary. The truck was ancient, older than Garrett's, and painted a faded forest green beneath layers of salt and snow. The driver's door opened. An elderly woman stepped out wearing a thick wool coat and carrying a flashlight. Garrett instinctively tensed. Old habits always assess. The woman moved carefully through the snow toward his truck. She had silver hair tucked beneath a knitted hat and sharp eyes that looked entirely too awake for midnight during a blizzard. She stopped beside Garrett's window and tapped lightly. Garrett lowered it halfway. Cold air exploded inside the cab. "You lost?" the woman asked. Her voice carried the calm firmness of somebody used to being obeyed. Garrett shook his head slightly. "Not exactly." The woman's eyes moved toward Atlas. The dog stared back silently. Then she looked toward the apothecary. "You planning on sleeping outside that building tonight?" Was considering it. That roof leaks in 3 places. Garrett almost smiled faintly. Good to know. The woman studied him longer this time. Not suspicious. Assessing. Finally she said, "You military?" Garrett nodded once. "Used to be, I figured." She glanced again toward Atlas's old harness. Then toward Garrett's hands, the scars, the posture, the exhaustion. People who knew war recognized it in others. "My name's Eleanor Pike," she said. "County clerk." Garrett blinked once. At midnight, Eleanor snorted softly. When you get old enough, sleep becomes more of a suggestion. That almost earned another smile from Garrett. Almost, the wind howled again. Eleanor pointed toward the apothecary. "You interested in that place?" Garrett hesitated. "Maybe. The county's been trying to unload it for 15 years. Why hasn't anyone bought it?" The old woman looked toward the dark building. "People around here say the place carries ghosts." Garrett leaned back slightly. "Ghosts don't bother me." "No," Eleanor replied quietly. "Usually they bother the people carrying them." For a second, neither spoke. Then Atlas suddenly pushed his nose against the glass and stared directly at Eleanor. Her expression changed, not fear, recognition. "Well," she murmured softly. "That's interesting," Garrett noticed immediately. "You know my dog?" "No. But I knew another shepherd once who used to sit exactly like that in front of that building." Garrett frowned. Eleanor turned back toward the apothecary again. "Place belonged to a man named Elias Granger, medic during Vietnam. Came home different, most of them did." Snow swirled around her boots. "He opened the apothecary after the war, sold herbal remedies, treated ranchers, fixed hunting injuries. Helped folks nobody else paid attention to anymore." "What happened to him?" Eleanor was silent a moment. "Depends who you ask." Garrett waited. "Some say he disappeared. And the others? They say he never really left." The wind groaned through the empty street again. Atlas whined softly. Eleanor looked at Garrett carefully. "You got somewhere warm to sleep tonight?" "No." She nodded once like she expected that answer. "Municipal office opens at 8. If you still want the building by morning, come see me." Garrett glanced toward the apothecary again. "You serious about the dollar?" "The county board hates that place." She shrugged. "Too expensive to restore. Too historic to demolish." She started back toward her truck, then stopped halfway. "One more thing." Garrett looked up. "Atlas," she said quietly. Garrett stiffened. "How do you know his name?" Eleanor pointed toward the dog's harness, the faded stitched letters. Garrett relaxed slightly. The old woman smiled faintly beneath the snow. "Get some sleep, Mr. Boone, Mr. Boone." She nodded once. "If that dog refuses to leave that porch by morning, I'd pay attention to him." Then she climbed back into her truck and disappeared into the storm. Garrett sat silently for a long time afterward. Atlas rested his head against the window facing the apothecary. The building stood motionless beneath the snow, waiting. By dawn the storm had weakened. Gray morning light spread slowly across Black Hollow, revealing old brick storefronts buried beneath fresh snow and railroad tracks disappearing into the mountains beyond town. Garrett woke stiff and cold inside the truck. Atlas was already awake, still watching the apothecary. Garrett rubbed his face and glanced at the fuel gauge again. Empty now. He reached for his wallet. $1 remained tucked inside, beside Nora's faded photograph. He stared at the picture briefly. Her smile, the sunlight in her hair, the hospital bracelet on her wrist during those final weeks. Garrett swallowed hard and closed the wallet again. Enough. Atlas climbed down from the truck the moment Garrett opened the door. The shepherd immediately trotted toward the apothecary porch, through deep snow. Purposeful. Garrett followed slowly. Morning revealed more details now. The building was larger than he first realized. 2 full stories, narrow upper windows, stone foundation beneath weathered cedar siding. The porch roof sagged slightly but remained intact. And somehow, despite decades of abandonment, none of the windows were broken. That felt strange. Most empty buildings died quickly in mountain towns. But this one endured. Atlas climbed the steps and stopped before the door again, then sat. Garrett sighed. "All right, old man. Let's see what's got your attention." At exactly 8 o'clock, Garrett Boone walked into the Black Hollow municipal office, carrying his last dollar in his coat pocket, while Atlas waited outside the apothecary door like a sentry, guarding something only he understood. The municipal office occupied the first floor of an old brick building beside the railroad tracks. The heater rattled loudly against the winter cold, filling the hallway with dry metallic warmth and the smell of burnt dust. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Garrett stamped snow from his boots and removed his gloves slowly. The walls were lined with faded photographs of Black Hollow from another century. Miners standing beside ore carts, logging crews holding axes, women in wool dresses gathered outside church socials. Every picture carried the same expression in the eyes: hard lives, hard winters. At the far end of the room sat Eleanor Pike behind a scarred oak desk stacked with folders and county forms. She wore thin reading glasses, low on her nose, and held a steaming mug of coffee between both hands. Without looking up, she said, "You came back." Garrett approached quietly. "Told you I might." Now she looked at him properly, then toward the door behind him. "Dog still out there?" "Wouldn't leave." Eleanor nodded once, like that confirmed something she already suspected. "Sit down, Mr. Boone." Garrett lowered himself carefully into the wooden chair across from her desk. Years of injuries had made every movement deliberate now. His right knee still stiffened during cold weather, after the explosion in Kunar Province 12 years earlier. Eleanor opened a thick file folder. "Black Hollow Apothecary," she said quietly. "Built in 1908. Original owner was Franklin Ritter. Place changed hands 3 times before Elias Granger bought it after Vietnam." She slid an old black and white photograph across the desk. Garrett picked it up. A younger man stood outside the apothecary beneath the same faded sign Garrett had seen last night. Tall, lean, dark-hair, army field jacket. One hand rested on the shoulder of a German shepherd sitting beside him. Garrett frowned. That his dog? Name was Mercy. The photograph looked strangely familiar. Not the man. The posture. The dog sitting beside him exactly the way Atlas had sat outside the building all night. Focused. Waiting. Garrett handed the photo back carefully. "What happened to him?" Eleanor leaned back in her chair. "No one knows for sure. Elias came home from Vietnam in 1969 after serving as a combat medic. Quiet man, smart. Folks trusted him. Opened the apothecary 6 months later." Outside, a train horn echoed somewhere through the snowy valley. "Long, lonely. He treated half the town for years," Eleanor continued. "Herbal remedies, pain salves, breathing tinctures. Folks came from ranches 40 miles away to see him." "Then what?" Eleanor's eyes drifted briefly toward the window. "Then one winter he locked the door and disappeared." Garrett crossed his arms slowly. "No investigation. Sheriff searched the mountains for weeks." She shrugged lightly. "Found nothing. That doesn't make sense." "No," Eleanor agreed softly. "It doesn't." The heater rattled louder behind them. Garrett looked around the office again. Old wood floors, railroad vibrations humming faintly beneath the walls. Dust floating through pale morning light. A town frozen somewhere between surviving and disappearing. "How much paperwork for the building?" he finally asked. Eleanor stared at him a long moment. "You serious?" Garrett pulled the wrinkled dollar bill from his pocket and placed it on the desk. The old woman looked down at it silently. Then she opened another drawer and removed a heavy brass key attached to a leather tag darkened by age. The moment Garrett saw the key, something shifted in the room. Not physically, emotionally, like crossing an invisible line. Eleanor placed the key gently atop the dollar bill. "That building belongs to you now, Mr. Boone." Garrett stared at the key without touching it. Home ownership. After sleeping in parking lots and roadside pullouts for nearly a year, the concept felt unreal. You sure the county board approved this? The county board stopped caring about that building a long time ago. She slid several papers toward him. Sign there, Garrett signed quietly. Halfway through the final page, the sharp blast of another train horn exploded outside the office. Instantly his body locked, his breathing stopped. Not a train anymore. Mortar siren, mountain pass. Afghanistan. The office disappeared. Suddenly Garrett was back inside the shattered valley, surrounded by smoke and gunfire. Snow became dust. Train vibration became helicopter rotors hammering overhead. His hands clenched hard against the desk, screaming over the radio. Blood in the snow. Miller falling beside the ridge. Move, 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 Mr. Boone. Eleanor's voice sounded far away. Garrett couldn't breathe. His pulse thundered violently inside his skull. Then the office door burst open. Atlas. The German shepherd crossed the room instantly and shoved his head beneath Garrett's shaking hand. Hard, grounding pressure. Garrett blinked. The office slowly returned around him. The heater, the desk, the photographs, snow outside the windows. Atlas pressed tighter against his knee until Garrett finally managed a breath, then another. Eleanor watched quietly without speaking. Garrett lowered his head. Sorry, no need. He rubbed both hands over his face slowly. The panic attack left exhaustion behind every time now. Like his nervous system burned itself empty afterward. Atlas rested beside him silently, always there before the spiral became complete. Garrett scratched gently behind the dog's ears. Good boy. Eleanor finally spoke again. My husband had those after Korea. Garrett looked up. Nightmares, too. She stared down at her coffee mug. Sometimes he'd wake up halfway across the room before he even realized he'd left the bed. Neither said anything for several seconds. Then Eleanor slid the brass key toward him once more. Elias had them too. Garrett looked at the key. What do you mean? He understood soldiers. Her eyes lifted carefully toward Garrett's. That's why people trusted him. Outside, snow drifted slowly through pale gray morning light. Garrett finally picked up the key. Cold metal, heavy, real. The moment it touched his palm, Atlas stood immediately. The dog moved toward the door before looking back once. Waiting, Garrett noticed. So he's done sitting guard? Eleanor smiled faintly. Looks more like he's taking you home. The walk back through town felt strangely quiet. Black Hollow had fully awakened now beneath the storm aftermath. Smoke rose from chimneys. Pickup trucks rolled carefully through snow-covered streets. A few townspeople glanced curiously toward Garrett and Atlas as they passed. Outsider, veteran, drifter. People in small mountain towns always noticed new arrivals. Garrett stopped outside the Apothecary porch again. Daylight revealed details hidden by darkness the night before. The porch railings carried intricate carved patterns beneath peeling paint. Frost coated the lower windows in delicate silver veins. Above the entrance hung an old iron lantern blackened with rust. Atlas climbed the steps first. No hesitation, Garrett unlocked the door. The brass key turned smoothly, too smoothly, like the lock had never truly stopped waiting. The heavy door creaked open inward. Cold, stale air drifted out, carrying the scent of dust, cedar wood, dried herbs, and something faintly medicinal buried beneath decades of silence. Garrett stepped inside slowly. The floorboards groaned under his boots. And for the first time in years, the noise inside his head softened. Not disappeared, just softened. The apothecary stretched long and narrow beneath dim gray daylight, filtering through dusty windows. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Hundreds of glass bottles sat untouched behind layers of dust. Some still carried faded handwritten labels: willow bark, juniper oil, valerian root, wintergreen. A massive oak counter ran the length of the room. Behind it stood the cabinet, tall, dark walnut, handcrafted. Its shelves towered nearly to the ceiling. Atlas walked directly toward it, then stopped. The German shepherd stared upward at the cabinet without moving. Garrett studied the room carefully. Military medical kits sat stacked along one wall beside old books and faded supply tins. An ancient army field jacket hung from a coat hook near the back hallway. Vietnam era, still there, still waiting. Garrett moved deeper into the building. Dust swirled through narrow beams of light. Every sound echoed softly inside the old structure. The upstairs staircase creaked beneath settling wood somewhere in the silence. The place should have felt abandoned. Instead, it felt paused, like someone had stepped out briefly and never returned. Atlas suddenly whined. Garrett turned. The dog had moved closer to the walnut cabinet now, closer than before. His nose hovered inches from the lower wooden panels. Then Atlas placed one paw carefully against the cabinet door and looked directly at Garrett. The same look he used to give before detecting hidden explosives overseas. Alert, focused, absolute certainty. Garrett felt the hairs rise slowly along his arms. "What is it, boy?" Atlas whined again, soft, urgent, and somewhere deep inside the old apothecary, beneath the silence and dust and frozen years, Garrett Boone began to feel the first faint stirrings of something waiting to be found. Atlas kept his paw pressed against the walnut cabinet. The old German shepherd stood perfectly still, except for the slow rise and fall of his breathing. Dust floated through pale winter light around him, turning the air silver inside the abandoned room. Garrett approached carefully. The cabinet was enormous up close. Dark walnut wood polished smooth by hands long gone. Brass handles lined dozens of narrow drawers stacked from floor to ceiling. Faded labels still clung beneath some of them: chamomile, echinacea, arnica, juniper resin. The smell surrounding the cabinet was different from the rest of the building. Warmer somehow, earthier, like dried roots and cedar hidden beneath decades of dust. Atlas whined again. Garrett crouched beside him. "What are you trying to tell me?" The dog pressed his nose toward the lower corner of the cabinet. Garrett studied the wood carefully. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. Then he noticed the scratches. Faint marks across the floorboards beneath the cabinet legs. Recent scratches, not decades old. Garrett frowned. He touched them with 2 fingers. Fresh wood dust still clung inside the grooves. Something heavy had moved here recently. A cold ripple worked slowly through his chest. Garrett stood and grabbed the flashlight hanging from his backpack. The beam swept across the lower cabinet panels, solid walnut. No gaps, no handles, nothing obvious. Atlas suddenly barked once, sharp, focused. Garrett turned the flashlight downward again. The dog pawed at the far right bottom section. Garrett knelt lower. That was when he noticed it. A faint draft. Cold air touched the side of his face near the floor. Impossible. The wall behind the cabinet should have been solid exterior stone. Yet air was moving. Very slightly. Garrett leaned closer. The draft was real. He slowly straightened. Years of military training instantly sharpened every sense inside him. Hidden compartments, false walls, underground tunnels. He had seen them all overseas. Atlas watched him carefully. "You knew." The dog's tail moved once against the dusty floor. Garrett stepped back from the cabinet. Then the loud crash exploded upstairs. Both Garrett and Atlas reacted instantly. Garrett spun toward the staircase while Atlas lunged protectively in front of him, teeth bared. Silence followed. Only the creaking groan of old wood settling somewhere above. Garrett's pulse hammered automatically now. Adrenaline. Combat instincts waking from deep sleep. He reached inside his coat and pulled out the old pistol he kept holstered beneath his shoulder. Atlas moved ahead of him immediately as Garrett approached the staircase. Step by step they climbed. The second floor was colder. Narrow hallways stretched beneath slanted ceilings. Old examination rooms stood open along one side, their doors hanging crooked on rusted hinges. Dust coated everything. An overturned chair lay near the far wall. That was the crash. Garrett swept the flashlight slowly across the hallway. No footprints except his own. No broken windows, nothing. Atlas sniffed carefully before relaxing slightly. The building itself had made the noise. Garrett lowered the pistol. Easy. Still something felt wrong. Not dangerous exactly. Aware. Like the apothecary noticed them moving through it. The upstairs apartment sat at the far end of the hall. Garrett pushed open the door slowly. A wave of stale air drifted out. The room remained frozen in another decade. A small iron stove stood beside the wall. An old wool blanket still covered a narrow bed beneath the window. Shelves filled with books lined one side of the room, while faded photographs rested atop a wooden desk beneath thick dust. Garrett moved closer. One photograph showed Elias Granger standing beside several men in military jackets outside the apothecary sometime during winter. All of them smiling, one missing arm, another using crutches, veterans. Garrett studied their faces quietly, the kind of men who never fully came home. Atlas wandered slowly through the apartment before stopping beside the bed. Then he lay down heavily. Garrett noticed the stiffness in the dog's back leg again. The limp had worsened during the storm. Atlas was getting old, too old. The realization hit harder these days. Garrett walked to the stove and checked the pipe connection. Still functional, barely. He could make this place livable, at least temporarily. Outside, snowfall thickened again against the upstairs windows. Wind swept through Black Hollow, carrying the distant metallic scream of train wheels from somewhere beyond town. The sound instantly triggered something sharp inside Garrett's chest. Another flash, another memory. Night operation, snow-covered ridge, radio static, Miller screaming for air beside shattered rocks. Garrett grabbed the edge of the desk hard. Not now. Atlas stood immediately and pressed against his leg again, grounding him, breathing. The room slowly returned. Garrett exhaled shakily and rubbed both hands across his face. Still pulling me out of hell, huh? Atlas rested his head briefly against Garrett's chest. The old dog's heartbeat felt steady beneath his fur. Alive, present, real. Garrett scratched behind Atlas's ears before looking around the apartment again. Something about Elias Granger unsettled him deeply now, not because the man disappeared, because Garrett already understood him. A combat medic comes home broken, finds isolation in the mountains, builds a place where damaged men can breathe. That wasn't mystery. That was survival. Garrett looked back toward the downstairs staircase, toward the cabinet, the draft, the scratches, something hidden beneath decades of silence. And Atlas somehow knew it was there. By late afternoon, Garrett had managed to clear enough dust downstairs to light the old potbelly stove near the front counter. The warmth spread slowly through the apothecary, while orange firelight danced against rows of ancient bottles. Outside, Black Hollow disappeared beneath another curtain of falling snow. Garrett heated canned soup over the stove while Atlas slept nearby. For the first time in months, Garrett wasn't watching a parking lot through cracked windows, wasn't listening for footsteps, wasn't preparing to leave before dawn. The feeling unsettled him almost as much as the cabinet. Night came early in the mountains. Darkness gathered around the apothecary windows while the storm deepened outside. The building creaked softly in the wind. Garrett sat behind the old oak counter, cleaning his pistol beneath the warm glow of a lantern. Atlas suddenly lifted his head. Every muscle in the dog's body tightened. Then he stood and walked directly toward the cabinet again. Garrett watched carefully now. Atlas sniffed the lower panel once, then scratched violently. Not playful, desperate. Wood splintered beneath his claws. All right. Garrett stood immediately and crossed the room. Atlas barked sharply again. Garrett pressed his hand against the cabinet's lower section. Cold air drifted stronger now, definitely stronger. He ran both hands carefully along the edges of the wood paneling, then stopped. There, a seam, almost invisible, a rectangular outline hidden within the walnut grain. Garrett's heartbeat slowed into the calm, dangerous rhythm he remembered from missions overseas. Focus, observation, patience. He crouched lower and examined the brass trim carefully. One section looked newer than the others, barely noticeable. Garrett reached into his pocket-knife pouch and slid the blade gently beneath the trim edge. Click. Something shifted inside the cabinet. Atlas backed away instantly. Garrett froze. A low metallic sound echoed from somewhere behind the wall. Then the entire lower cabinet panel moved inward half an inch. Garrett stared at it. Slowly, carefully, he pulled the hidden section outward. Behind it sat a narrow steel door built directly into the wall itself. Industrial, heavy, military-grade, and locked. Atlas stepped beside Garrett and stared directly at the hidden door as another gust of icy air escaped through the seams. The old German shepherd let out one low, uneasy growl. Garrett touched the cold steel carefully. Someone had hidden something beneath the apothecary. Something important enough to bury behind a false cabinet wall. And suddenly, Garrett understood why Atlas refused to leave this building. Because whatever waited behind that steel door had been waiting for them. The storm intensified outside. Snow hammered the windows of the apothecary, while wind roared through Black Hollow, like something alive moving through the mountains. The old building groaned softly around Garrett and Atlas, its ancient beams shifting beneath the weight of winter. But Garrett barely heard any of it now. His attention remained fixed on the hidden steel door behind the cabinet. Atlas stood beside him, rigid and alert. Garrett ran both hands slowly across the cold metal surface. The door had no visible handle, only a circular lock mechanism set into the center. Military grade. Old, very old. A faded layer of black paint peeled from the steel in narrow strips, exposing dull gray beneath. Someone had built this to survive decades underground. Garrett crouched lower with the lantern. More scratches, not random, tool marks around the locking mechanism. Someone else had tried opening this door before. His heartbeat slowed into the steady, focused rhythm he remembered from missions overseas. The calm before entering dangerous places. Atlas suddenly sniffed near the lower seam and stepped back. The dog's ears flattened slightly. Garrett noticed immediately. "What is it?" Atlas stared at the darkness beneath the door. Not fear. Unease. Garrett reached into his backpack and pulled out a small pry bar and flashlight. The tools felt strangely familiar in his hands. Not because he missed combat. He never missed combat. But some parts of a soldier never fully disappeared. Observation. Pattern recognition. Preparation. He studied the locking mechanism carefully. Then he saw it. A small recessed notch beneath the metal wheel. Garrett inserted the pry bar gently. The lock shifted with a loud metallic clunk. Atlas jerked backward instantly. The sound echoed through the apothecary like a gunshot. Then silence returned. Garrett wrapped both hands around the steel wheel and pulled. At first, nothing happened. Then slowly, the hidden door opened inward with a deep, grinding groan. Cold air rushed upward immediately. Not ordinary cold, underground cold. The smell rising from below carried earth, rust, old paper, machine oil, and something faintly medicinal buried beneath decades of darkness. Garrett lifted the lantern higher. Stone stairs descended beneath the apothecary into blackness. Atlas remained frozen at the doorway. Garrett looked at him carefully. "You don't want to go down there?" The dog whined softly. Then, despite his hesitation, Atlas stepped forward beside Garrett anyway, always beside him. Garrett rested one hand briefly against the shepherd's neck. Together. The lantern light flickered against rough stone walls as they descended slowly underground. The staircase seemed deeper than it should have been. 10 steps, 15, 20. The air grew colder. The sounds of the storm faded until only silence remained. Then Garrett reached the bottom and stopped completely. The underground room stretched wider than he expected beneath the apothecary. Not a cellar, a bunker. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Old military supply crates sat stacked beside filing cabinets. A heavy wooden desk occupied the center of the room beneath hanging work lamps coated in dust. Everything remained untouched, frozen in time. Garrett moved the lantern slowly. Maps covered one wall: Montana wilderness maps, railroad maps, hand-marked hiking routes through the mountains. Beside them hung military field medic bags, army jackets, faded photographs, and an old emergency radio system connected to a rusted generator in the corner. Atlas moved carefully through the room, sniffing everything. His claws clicked softly against concrete. Garrett approached the desk first. Dust covered every surface except one small section near the center, recently disturbed. His pulse tightened slightly. Someone had been down here, not years ago, recently. Garrett swept the lantern toward the shelves. Glass jars filled with dried herbs lined one side of the bunker beside military first aid supplies. Morphine kits, bandages, surgical instruments sealed inside faded green cases. A sanctuary built by a medic. Then Garrett noticed the letters, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, neatly stacked bundles tied with string. Each envelope carried handwritten names and addresses from across the country. Texas, Wyoming, Virginia, Idaho, Ohio veterans. Garrett picked one up carefully. The envelope had never been mailed. His eyes moved across the handwriting. Dear Ellen, I know I don't deserve to come home after what happened overseas. Garrett stopped reading. A heavy feeling settled slowly inside his chest. Confessions. Final letters. Words written by men who couldn't find their way back into ordinary life. Atlas wandered toward the far side of the bunker, then stopped abruptly. The dog stared toward the wall beside an old filing cabinet. Garrett followed. Photographs. Dozens pinned carefully across the concrete. Soldiers, ranchers, old men beside campfires. Veterans standing outside the apothecary across different decades. Some smiling, some unable to. Garrett's lantern moved slowly across them until suddenly he froze. One photograph near the center stole the breath from his lungs. A younger Elias Granger stood beside another man wearing Navy corpsman fatigues during Vietnam. Both covered in mud, both exhausted, and the second man. Garrett's knees nearly gave out beneath him. No, his voice barely escaped. The photograph trembled in his hand now, because the man standing beside Elias Granger was his father. Daniel Boone, younger, alive, wearing military gear Garrett had never known existed. Garrett stared at the image in disbelief. His father had died when Garrett was 11 years old. Heart attack, factory worker. That was the story his mother told him his entire life. But this photograph shattered everything. Daniel Boone had served in Vietnam. Not only served, he had known Elias Granger personally. Garrett stepped backward slowly. Atlas moved instantly beside him. The room suddenly felt too small, too cold, too alive. Garrett's breathing quickened. Impossible. His mother would never have lied about something like this. Would she? His flashlight beam shook across the photographs again. There were more. Daniel Boone beside helicopters. Daniel Boone standing outside military tents. Daniel Boone smiling beside Elias and several wounded soldiers near a field hospital. Garrett stared at the faces for a long time. His father looked younger than Garrett remembered, lighter somehow, before life crushed something inside him. Then Garrett noticed another detail. Pinned beneath the main photograph was a handwritten note. Daniel Boone saved 6 men during the Khe Sanh extraction, 1968. Garrett swallowed hard. The room tilted slightly around him. His father had never spoken about Vietnam, never mentioned combat, never once admitted he served. Garrett suddenly remembered small things from childhood. The nightmares, the drinking, The silence at fireworks shows. The way his father stared into empty rooms sometimes, like he was listening to voices nobody else could hear. Garrett had inherited more than he realized. Atlas nudged his hand gently, grounding him again. Garrett knelt beside the dog and gripped his harness tightly. "What is this place?" His voice cracked quietly. The lantern light flickered across the bunker walls. Then Garrett noticed the tape recorder. Old reel-to-reel equipment sat beside the desk with dozens of labeled cassette tapes stacked nearby. Each carried names and dates. Interview 4 Jaywalker, March 1972, Night Terror Session, T. Holland, April 1974, Panic Episodes. R. Morales. Garrett stared at them in silence. Elias Granger had been documenting broken soldiers for decades, trying to save them, trying to understand them. Atlas suddenly growled softly. "Low. Warning." Garrett looked up instantly. The dog was staring toward the staircase leading back upstairs. Both of them listened carefully. At first there was nothing then. A sound, very faint, floorboards creaking above them. Someone was inside the apothecary. Garrett extinguished the lantern immediately. Darkness swallowed the bunker whole. Atlas moved silently beside him. Above them, slow footsteps crossed the floorboards upstairs. Not wind, not settling wood. Human footsteps. Garrett's hand moved automatically toward the pistol beneath his coat, while his heartbeat settled into deadly calm. Someone else knew about the hidden room, and they had just entered the apothecary. Garrett remained perfectly still in the darkness beneath the building. Atlas stood beside him without making a sound, his body rigid, ears forward, eyes fixed toward the staircase above. Another creak echoed faintly through the floorboards overhead. Slow footsteps, measured, careful. Not the random movement of an animal, human. Garrett drew the pistol from beneath his coat and clicked off the safety with his thumb. Years of combat training settled over him like cold water. His breathing slowed, his mind sharpened. Above them, something shifted across the main floor. A drawer opening, then silence again. Garrett leaned close to Atlas's ear. "Stay." The shepherd gave the slightest movement of his head. Garrett climbed the stairs slowly, careful to avoid the center of each step, where old wood might groan louder. The darkness above looked thicker now, the lantern still extinguished downstairs. Halfway up the staircase, he stopped, listened. The apothecary had gone quiet again, too quiet. Snow hissed softly against the windows outside. The storm continued swallowing the town beyond the walls. Garrett reached the hidden cabinet opening and peered carefully into the dark dispensary room. Nothing moved. The stove still glowed faintly near the front counter. Shadows stretched long across rows of dusty shelves. Then Atlas growled softly below him. Garrett turned instantly. A shape moved outside the front windows. Someone crossing the porch. By the time Garrett reached the front door and pulled it open, the street outside stood empty beneath blowing snow. No vehicle headlights, no footsteps, nothing except storm wind swirling beneath the street lamps. But Garrett noticed fresh boot prints leading away from the porch. Large, heavy tread, already filling with snow. Someone had been inside. Someone who knew enough to search the building quietly. Garrett scanned the empty street one last time before closing and locking the door. Then he stood motionless in the center of the apothecary, while the old building creaked softly around him. The hidden room no longer felt abandoned. It felt exposed. Atlas returned from downstairs and stood beside Garrett again. The shepherd's gray muzzle glistened faintly in the firelight. Garrett scratched gently behind his ears. "Looks like we're not alone after all." Atlas stared toward the hidden cabinet. Garrett followed his gaze. Then something inside him made a decision. He locked the front entrance, closed every curtain in the building, and returned underground. If someone else wanted whatever was hidden here, then Garrett needed to know why. The bunker felt colder the second time, more intimate. The secrets inside no longer belonged to dead strangers now. His father's face stared back at him from the photographs pinned across the wall. Daniel Boone, Vietnam corpsman, a man Garrett never truly knew. Garrett sat heavily at the wooden desk and picked up one of the cassette tapes again. Night Terror Session, R. Morales, February 1973. Beside the recorder sat headphones coated in dust. Garrett hesitated, then pressed play. Static crackled softly through the room. For several seconds, there was only tape hiss. Then a tired male voice emerged. "I still wake up smelling the jungle." Garrett froze. The voice sounded old, exhausted, like gravel dragged across concrete. "I know I'm in Montana now, but some nights I still hear the helicopters. Sometimes I wake up halfway outside before I remember where I am." A second voice answered calmly. "Elias Granger. You're safe here, Raymond." Silence followed. Then the first man spoke again. "No offense, Doc, but safe stopped meaning anything over there." Garrett lowered his eyes. The tape continued. The veteran described panic attacks, flashbacks, drinking, isolation, shame for surviving when other men did not. Every word landed like a hammer inside Garrett's chest, because he knew those thoughts, knew them intimately. The tape clicked softly as the conversation continued. "You ever tell your family any of this?" Elias asked. A bitter laugh answered him. "How do you explain war to people who still sleep through thunderstorms?" Garrett removed the headphones slowly. The bunker suddenly felt unbearably heavy. Atlas moved closer and rested beside the desk. Garrett looked around at the shelves again. Dozens of tapes. Hundreds, maybe. Elias Granger had spent decades listening to broken men nobody else wanted to hear. Garrett reached for another tape. Panic Episode, T. Walker, 1975. Then another. Sleep Disturbance, H. Collins. Combat Guilt, J. Mercer. The names stretched across years. Across generations, the men changed, the wounds did not. Hours passed underground while the storm buried Black Hollow deeper beneath snow. Garrett listened to voices from different wars describing the same invisible pain. Nightmares. Isolation, rage, fear of crowds, fear of silence, fear of themselves. One older Marine described sitting in his truck outside his own house for 3 hours every night before forcing himself to walk inside. Another admitted he trusted his dog more than any human alive. Garrett stared at Atlas after hearing that one. The shepherd slept lightly beside the desk, paws twitching faintly as he dreamed. The old combat injury along his rear leg had stiffened badly from the cold. Garrett gently adjusted the blanket around him. "You carried me long enough," he whispered quietly. Atlas opened one eye briefly before drifting back asleep. Garrett rubbed tired hands across his face. His father had hidden this entire life. Vietnam, combat, trauma, everything. Why? Because that generation didn't talk. They buried it beneath factory jobs and whiskey and silence until it poisoned everything around them. Garrett suddenly remembered the day his father died. 11 years old. Rain outside the hospital windows. His mother crying beside a vending machine. And one strange detail Garrett never understood until now. The military officer who attended the funeral. At the time, Garrett assumed the man had confused services somehow. Now he understood. His father had been a soldier long before he became a factory worker. Garrett stood and moved toward the wall of photographs again. Then he noticed something hidden behind one frame. A folded piece of paper. He carefully removed it. A handwritten list, names, states. At the top, written in Elias Granger's careful handwriting. Men who found their way back. Garrett scanned the list slowly. Some names had check marks beside them. Others ended with single crosses. Dead. The room suddenly felt sacred. Not like a bunker. Like a graveyard for invisible wounds. And maybe a sanctuary, too. Garrett looked around differently now. The herbs, the tapes, the journals. The hidden room beneath the mountains. Elias hadn't simply hidden from the world here. He had built something. A place where damaged soldiers could exist without pretending to be normal. Garrett understood that need better than he wanted to admit. Above them, the apothecary groaned softly in the wind. Atlas suddenly lifted his head again. Alert, Garrett listened. This time there were no footsteps, only the storm. Still, the feeling remained. Someone out there knew about this room. Someone searching for something hidden beneath Black Hollow. Garrett moved toward the filing cabinets against the far wall. Most drawers contained medical records, handwritten treatment notes, and personal journals from veterans spanning nearly 30 years. Then he found the locked drawer. Unlike the others, this cabinet carried a small brass padlock. Atlas walked over immediately. The dog sniffed the drawer once, then looked directly at Garrett. Garrett examined the lock. Old, simple. After a moment, he used the pry bar again. The lock snapped easily. Inside sat only 3 objects: a revolver, a yellowed envelope, and another photograph. Garrett picked up the picture first. His stomach tightened instantly. The photograph showed Elias Granger standing outside the apothecary beside a younger man wearing an expensive winter coat, clean-cut, smiling. Behind them stood bulldozers, survey markers, construction equipment. Written across the back in faded ink, Curtis Vane's father, November 1970. Garrett frowned. The name hit him immediately. Vane, Black Hollow's largest landowner. The man Eleanor mentioned during town paperwork earlier that morning. Garrett studied the photograph harder. Neither man looked friendly. They looked like men negotiating something dangerous. Then Garrett opened the envelope. Inside sat a single handwritten sentence. If they ever come back for the room, do not trust the Vanes. Garrett stared at the words in silence. Atlas growled softly beside him. And somewhere above, the apothecary. Outside in the storm-dark mountains surrounding Black Hollow, headlights appeared briefly through the snow before disappearing again into the night. Garrett stood motionless inside the hidden bunker. The note remained clenched in his hand. If they ever come back for the room, do not trust the Vanes. The words felt heavier than the revolver lying beside them. Atlas kept staring toward the ceiling, listening. The old shepherd's instincts had saved Garrett more than once in Afghanistan. If Atlas sensed danger now, Garrett trusted it. He carefully folded the note and slipped it into his coat pocket. Then he took the revolver. The weapon was old, but well-maintained. Smith & Wesson .38 with worn wooden grips polished smooth by decades of use. Garrett opened the cylinder automatically, loaded, every chamber full. Elias Granger had expected trouble. Garrett slid the revolver into his waistband beside his own pistol before extinguishing the lantern again. Darkness swallowed the bunker. Only the faint glow from the staircase above remained visible. Garrett moved silently upward with Atlas close behind him. The apothecary was still empty. At least it looked empty. Snow scraped against the windows, while the pot-belly stove crackled softly near the counter. Shadows shifted across shelves of dusty bottles as the firelight flickered. Garrett crossed carefully toward the front windows. Outside, Black Hollow slept beneath deep snow and drifting fog. No headlights anymore, no vehicles. But fresh tie tracks curved away from the side street leading toward the mountains north of town. Garrett stared at them for a long moment. Someone had come to the apothecary in the middle of a blizzard. Someone who knew enough to search quietly. And now someone connected to the Vane family was somehow tied to Elias Granger's hidden bunker. Atlas suddenly limped toward the stove and lowered himself heavily beside the warmth. Garrett noticed the stiffness immediately. The old injury in the dog's rear leg had worsened again. He crouched beside Atlas and gently checked the scar tissue beneath the fur. Atlas stayed still. Trusted hands. The injury came from Helmand Province 7 years earlier during a night raid gone wrong. Shrapnel tore through Atlas's hip while pulling Garrett behind cover after an explosion. The military vets said the dog should have been retired immediately. Some quietly recommended euthanasia. Too much nerve damage, too much pain. Garrett remembered standing in that military clinic with blood still on his uniform, while Atlas lay sedated beneath fluorescent lights. "He's still operational," Garrett told them. One doctor shook his head. "He's suffering." "No," Garrett answered quietly. "He's fighting." And Atlas kept fighting. Even now. Garrett scratched gently beneath the shepherd's chin. "You and me both, huh?" Atlas leaned weakly against his leg. Outside, dawn slowly approached behind the storm clouds. By morning, the snowfall had stopped. Black Hollow emerged from the blizzard, buried beneath fresh white silence. Smoke rose from chimneys across town, while snowplows crawled along Main Street, clearing narrow paths between buildings. Garrett stood on the apothecary porch, drinking black coffee heated on the old stove. Atlas rested nearby beneath a wool blanket. The dog barely slept anymore, unless Garrett stayed close. A truck engine approached through the snow. Garrett looked up. A dark green Ford F-250 rolled slowly down the street before stopping directly in front of the apothecary. The driver stepped out. Tall, expensive coat, clean-shaven, mid-50s. Everything about the man looked polished in a way that felt unnatural against the rough mountain town around him. Garrett instantly understood who he was: Curtis Vane. The man walked up the porch, steps calmly, while surveying the building with narrowed eyes. His boots barely made sound against the snow. Atlas rose immediately, low growl. Curtis noticed the dog first. "Well," he said softly, "that explains the tracks." Garrett said nothing. Curtis stopped several feet away. "Curtis Vane, I know." A faint smile touched the man's face. "Then you probably also know this building belongs in my redevelopment zone." Garrett sipped coffee quietly. "County sold it yesterday. For $1. Curtis glanced around the apothecary porch with visible irritation. Small towns make emotional decisions. "You got a point?" Curtis looked directly at Garrett now. "I'll give you $20,000 for the property." Garrett almost laughed. $20,000 for a collapsing apothecary in a dying railroad town? No, not for the building. For whatever lay beneath it. Atlas growled louder. Curtis took a small step back instinctively. Friendly dog. He was trained not to be. The wind moved softly through the street between them. Curtis studied Garrett more carefully now. "You military?" "Used to be." Ah, that single word carried recognition, maybe even calculation. Curtis nodded slowly toward the building. "You probably don't understand what you bought here." Garrett's eyes narrowed slightly. "Then explain it." Curtis smiled faintly. "This valley's changing. Ski investors, luxury properties. Tourism money. Black Hollow won't stay a forgotten railroad town forever. And the apothecary's in the way? It's sitting on land people are willing to pay for." Garrett leaned lightly against the porch railing. "Funny thing is, people usually don't offer 20 grand for buildings falling apart." Curtis's smile disappeared. For the first time, tension surfaced beneath his calm expression. "You seem like a practical man, Mr. Boone. You know my name." Curtis ignored that. "Take the money. Find someplace warmer. Easier." Atlas barked sharply. "Not warning, hatred." Curtis glanced toward the dog again. And Garrett noticed something important. Fear. Small. Brief, but real. Curtis Vane was afraid of Atlas. Interesting. Garrett lowered the coffee cup slowly. "I'm staying." The silence afterward felt colder than the weather. Curtis studied him for several seconds before nodding once. "People around here get attached to ghosts." His eyes drifted briefly toward the apothecary windows. "Usually doesn't end well." Then he turned and walked back toward his truck. Before climbing inside, he paused. "One more thing." Garrett waited. "If you find anything unusual in that building, old documents, records, valuables." Curtis adjusted his gloves carefully. "The Vane family has historical claims connected to this property." Garrett stared at him. "There it is." Curtis gave a thin smile. "I'm only trying to help avoid legal complications." No, Garrett replied quietly. You're trying to figure out what Elias Granger left behind. For the first time, Curtis lost control of his expression completely. Only for a second, but Garrett saw it. Recognition. Then Curtis climbed into the truck and drove away without another word. Atlas kept growling until the vehicle disappeared around the corner. Garrett watched the tire tracks vanish into snow. Then he looked back toward the apothecary, toward the hidden bunker below it, toward the photographs of his father, toward the letters written by broken veterans nobody remembered anymore. This wasn't about land. It never had been. Someone wanted whatever Elias Granger hid underground badly enough to monitor the building during storms and offer cash within 24 hours of the sale, which meant the hidden room contained something more valuable than old journals. Atlas limped beside Garrett as they re-entered the apothecary. The warmth inside felt different now, less like shelter, more like a battlefield waiting to wake up. Garrett locked the front door again. Then he noticed the window, tiny crack near the lower frame. Fresh. He moved closer. Outside beneath the sill lay broken glass buried in snow. Someone had tested the building overnight. Atlas walked directly toward the back hallway again. Focused, protective. The shepherd stopped beside the cabinet and stared toward the hidden steel door, guarding it. Garrett rubbed tired eyes slowly. He had come to Montana with nothing left, no mission, no future. No reason to keep moving except the old dog beside him. Now suddenly there was purpose again. Mystery, danger, questions. And for the first time in years, Garrett Boone felt awake. Then a vehicle horn sounded outside. Garrett crossed toward the front window cautiously. A faded blue Jeep had parked beside the curb. A woman stepped out carrying a veterinary medical bag through the snow. Mid-40s, dark brown hair tucked beneath a knitted cap, warm eyes, practical boots. Atlas recognized her instantly. His tail moved once. Garrett frowned slightly. The woman climbed the porch steps and knocked gently on the glass. "Mr. Boone," she called through the door. "Eleanor Pike said your dog might need help." Garrett unlocked the door carefully. The woman smiled faintly. Claire Holloway. She lifted the medical bag slightly. "Town veterinarian." Atlas limped toward her immediately, and for the first time since arriving in Black Hollow, Garrett saw the old shepherd relax. Atlas limped across the apothecary floor toward Claire Holloway without hesitation. That alone surprised Garrett. The German shepherd trusted almost nobody anymore. Not after Afghanistan, not after the explosions, not after the years drifting from town to town, with only Garrett beside him. But now Atlas stood calmly, while Claire crouched in the middle of the old apothecary and extended her gloved hand. "Well, hey there, handsome," she said softly. Atlas sniffed her fingers once, then leaned against her knee. Claire smiled gently. "That's a good sign." Snowlight filtered through the dusty windows behind her, outlining loose strands of dark hair escaping from beneath her knit cap. Her face carried the kind of tired kindness Garrett recognized immediately in people who spent their lives taking care of wounded things, human or otherwise. Claire opened her medical bag beside the stove. "You mind if I take a look at him?" Garrett nodded once. "He won't bite unless he thinks I'm threatened." Claire glanced up with a faint smile. "Same rule applies to me." Garrett almost smiled back. Almost. Atlas lowered himself carefully onto the old rug near the fire, while Claire examined his injured leg. Her hands moved confidently through the thick fur, checking joints and scar tissue with practiced gentleness. "He's older than I expected," she murmured. 12. Claire looked up immediately. 12, her expression softened. "That's a long life for a working shepherd. He earned every year." Atlas watched Garrett while Claire continued the examination. The apothecary felt strangely warm now, despite the storm outside. Firelight flickered across rows of dusty medicine bottles, while snow drifted silently past the windows. For a brief moment, Garrett almost forgot the hidden bunker beneath them. Almost. Claire carefully flexed Atlas's hind leg. The dog winced slightly but stayed still. Old shrapnel injury? Garrett looked at her sharply. You can tell? My husband came home with similar damage. Claire wrapped the shepherd's leg gently with fresh support bandaging from her kit. Army medic, Iraq. Garrett nodded slowly. What happened? Claire kept her eyes on Atlas while answering. Truck bomb outside Mosul. Her voice remained calm, but something inside it tightened faintly. He survived the explosion. Couldn't survive what came afterward. Garrett understood immediately. PTSD, depression, the long invisible war afterward. Claire finished wrapping Atlas's leg and sat back quietly. Black Hollow gets a lot of veterans passing through, she said. Most don't stay. Garrett glanced around the apothecary. Maybe they should. Claire followed his gaze toward the old shelves and cabinets. You know about Elias Granger? A little. My father knew him. She stood and wandered slowly toward the walnut cabinet. People around here used to say, Elias could look at a man for 30 seconds and know exactly how broken he was. Garrett watched her carefully. Claire stopped near the hidden cabinet door without noticing what lay behind it. He helped my husband once, she said quietly. Long before I met him. Garrett felt tension rise slightly in his chest. How? Claire ran her fingers lightly across one of the dusty cabinet drawers. After Iraq, Ben couldn't sleep. Crowds terrified him. Fireworks nearly destroyed him every 4th of July. She smiled sadly. One night, he drove into the mountains planning not to come back. Garrett stayed silent. He ended up here instead. The fire crackled softly nearby. Claire looked around the apothecary slowly, almost reverently. Elias sat with him all night. No judgment, no speeches, just listened. Her eyes lowered slightly. Ben said it was the first time since the war he felt understood. Garrett looked toward the hidden room beneath them. The tapes, the letters, the photographs, the broken men. This building had never been just an apothecary. It had been a refuge. Claire turned back toward Garrett. Eleanor says you bought the place for $1. Looks like I overpaid. That earned a small laugh. The sound surprised both of them. Then Atlas suddenly stood. Every muscle in his body tightened again. Garrett saw it instantly. The dog moved toward the rear hallway leading to the cabinet. Focused, alert. Claire noticed too. What's wrong with him? Garrett hesitated, then made a decision. Come here. He crossed toward the cabinet and opened the hidden panel carefully. Claire froze when the steel door became visible behind the false wall. My God. Garrett studied her face carefully for any sign of recognition. There was none. Only shock. You didn't know? Claire shook her head slowly. No one knew. Garrett opened the bunker door. Cold air drifted upward immediately. Claire stared into the darkness below with wide eyes. What is this place? I'm still figuring that out. Together they descended into the hidden room while Atlas moved ahead cautiously. Claire stopped halfway down the staircase. The bunker spread before them beneath lantern light, maps, journals, photographs, military equipment, shelves of tapes and letters stretching through the underground chamber. Her eyes filled instantly. Oh, Elias! She moved slowly through the room as though walking through a church. Garrett watched her carefully. Claire picked up one of the letters tied in faded string. Her hands trembled slightly. These are veterans' names. There are hundreds. Claire looked around the bunker in disbelief. He kept all this hidden. Looks that way. Atlas wandered toward the far wall again. The same wall where Garrett found the photograph of his father. Claire stopped beside the photographs now, then suddenly froze. Oh my God. Garrett stepped closer. Claire pointed toward one of the older photographs pinned near the corner. A younger version of her husband Ben stood outside the apothecary beside Elias Granger, smiling, healthy, alive. Claire covered her mouth with trembling fingers. I've never seen this picture before. Garrett stayed silent. Claire reached up carefully and touched the edge of the photograph. "He never told me he came here." Her voice cracked softly. The bunker grew very quiet around them. Above their heads, wind moaned faintly through the old apothecary. Claire wiped quickly at her eyes before turning toward the shelves again. Then she noticed the second compartment. Hidden behind a stack of filing cabinets. Garrett. He crossed beside her. A narrow crack ran through the concrete wall behind the shelves. Too straight to be natural. Garrett immediately understood. Another hidden space. Atlas already stood waiting beside it. Garrett moved the cabinet aside carefully. Behind it sat a recessed wooden panel built into the wall itself, old handmade, different from the steel bunker door. Claire whispered softly. "There's more." Garrett pried the panel open slowly. Inside sat dozens more letters, hundreds maybe, carefully bundled and organized year by year. Some envelopes remained sealed. Others had been opened and resealed. Many carried military unit insignias drawn in faded ink. Garrett picked one carefully from the nearest stack. The handwriting looked shaky. "Dear Anna, I wanted to come home different than this." He stopped reading. Claire opened another. A Marine apologizing to his daughter for being afraid of loud noises. Another from a Navy corpsman unable to sleep indoors anymore. Another from a helicopter pilot who confessed he still counted exits inside every restaurant. The bunker suddenly felt crowded with ghosts, not violent ghosts, lonely ones. Men who survived wars but lost themselves afterward. Claire wiped tears quietly from her cheeks while reading one unfinished letter. Then Garrett noticed something near the back of the compartment. A black leather journal, different from the others. He opened it carefully. Inside, Elias Granger's handwriting filled the pages, patient observations, treatment notes, personal reflections. Then one entry stopped Garrett cold. June 18, 1989, Daniel Boone's son would be approximately 17 now. If he inherited his father's storms, I pray life gives him softer ground than war. Garrett stared at the words without breathing. Claire looked up slowly. "What is it?" Garrett handed her the journal silently. She read the entry twice, then looked at him. "He knew about you." Garrett felt the room tilt slightly again. Not coincidence, not random. Elias Granger had expected him someday. Somehow, Atlas suddenly growled low in his throat. Garrett turned instantly. A sound echoed faintly above them. Not footsteps this time. A door slamming somewhere upstairs. Hard, both Garrett and Claire froze. Then came another sound. Glass breaking. Atlas barked violently. Garrett drew his pistol immediately. Someone had entered the apothecary again. And this time, they weren't being quiet anymore. The sound of breaking glass echoed violently through the apothecary above them. Atlas exploded into motion first. The old German shepherd charged toward the staircase with a deep, savage bark Garrett had not heard in years. Not fear, combat instinct. Garrett grabbed the lantern with one hand and his pistol with the other. "Stay behind me," he told Claire. She nodded once, pale but steady. The three of them climbed from the bunker fast. Another crash thundered overhead. Then footsteps, running. Garrett reached the top of the stairs and froze. The front display window had been smashed inward. Snow blew through the broken glass in violent gusts, while icy wind scattered shattered bottles across the wooden floor. One of the apothecary shelves had been overturned near the entrance. But the intruder was gone. Garrett crossed toward the window carefully, pistol raised. Outside, a dark figure sprinted through the snow toward the alley beside the railroad tracks. "Stop!" The figure never turned. Atlas lunged forward instantly. "No!" Garrett shouted. Too late. The shepherd burst through the broken doorway into the storm. Garrett followed immediately. Snow blinded him the second he hit the street. Wind tore through Black Hollow, hard enough to sting his face, while the fleeing man disappeared between buildings ahead. Atlas moved faster than any 12-year-old dog should have been capable of moving. straight toward the intruder. Garrett chased after them down the alley beside the tracks. His boots slipped against packed snow, while train cars loomed dark beside him like steel cliffs. The figure reached the far end of the alley, then turned suddenly. Garrett saw the flash of metal, a tire iron. Atlas hit the man before he could swing. Both crashed violently into the snow. The intruder screamed as the German shepherd slammed him against the frozen ground. Garrett closed the distance fast, pistol aimed forward. "Don't move." The masked man struggled beneath Atlas, trying to strike the dog with the tire iron. Garrett kicked the weapon away and yanked the man upright against the side of a freight car. "Who sent you?" The man said nothing, only breathing hard through the ski mask. Garrett ripped the mask off. Young, maybe 30, local. Fear filled the man's face the second he looked at Garrett. "I didn't steal nothing." "Who sent you?" "Nobody." Atlas barked inches from the man's face. Garrett pressed him harder against the train car. "You knew about the hidden room." The man's eyes widened slightly. That was enough. Before Garrett could say another word, headlights exploded across the alley. A truck accelerated toward them through the snow. Fast, too fast. "Move!" Garrett grabbed Atlas and dove sideways as the truck roared through the alley. Snow blasted across them, while the young intruder tore free and scrambled into the passenger side before the vehicle disappeared into the storm. Garrett caught only one detail before the truck vanished. The company logo painted across the driver's door. Vane Development Group. Atlas growled violently beside him. Garrett knelt quickly to check the dog. Blood. Fresh blood along Atlas's shoulder. The intruder had cut him during the struggle. Damn it. Atlas ignored the injury completely, still staring down the alley after the truck. Claire reached them seconds later, breathless from the chase. "Oh my God." She dropped beside Atlas immediately. "He's hurt. It's shallow," Garrett muttered. But the sight of blood against the shepherd's gray fur hit him harder than expected. Atlas had already given enough to war. Claire examined the wound quickly. Not deep, but he needs stitches. Atlas stayed close to Garrett, while Claire wrapped the shoulder tightly with gauze beneath the swirling snow. Then all three of them looked back toward the apothecary. The broken front window glowed dimly beneath the storm. Garrett's expression darkened slowly. "They know about the bunker." Claire stood beside him quietly. "What exactly is Curtis Vane looking for?" Garrett thought about the journals, the letters, the hidden warning from Elias, and his father's photograph. "I don't think it's money." They returned to the apothecary together. Inside, freezing wind swept through the broken entrance, while snow collected across the wooden floorboards. Glass crunched beneath Garrett's boots as he surveyed the damage. The intruder had searched everywhere. Cabinets forced open, drawers emptied, shelves overturned. But one thing mattered most. The hidden cabinet remained untouched. The intruder hadn't found the bunker entrance. Not yet. Garrett carefully covered the broken window with heavy canvas from upstairs, while Claire stitched Atlas's shoulder wound beside the stove. The old shepherd never took his eyes off Garrett during the procedure. "You've got one loyal dog," Claire said quietly. Garrett tied off the last rope securing the canvas. "He's the only reason I'm still alive." Claire looked up at him. She understood that answer more than most people would. Outside, darkness settled over Black Hollow again. The storm worsened toward evening. By nightfall, the town vanished completely beneath blizzard winds. Garrett secured every door twice, then 3 times. Atlas stayed near the hidden cabinet all evening, guarding it, watching. Around midnight, Garrett finally sat beside the stove while Claire slept upstairs in the small apartment. The weather had become too dangerous for her to drive home safely. The apothecary creaked softly around him. Warm firelight danced across old medicine bottles, while snow hissed against the boarded entrance. Garrett stared at Elias's journal resting on the counter. One page remained open beneath the lantern glow. Some men survive combat. Others only survive long enough to bury it. Very few learn how to live afterward. Garrett rubbed tired hands across his face. The words felt personal now. Too personal. Atlas suddenly lifted his head. The shepherd growled low again. Garrett listened carefully. At first he heard nothing beyond the storm. Then, a faint smell. Smoke. Garrett stood instantly. Not stove smoke, oil gasoline. Atlas barked violently. Then flames exploded outside the front windows. The entire porch ignited in one terrifying burst. Garrett spun toward the entrance in disbelief. Fire raced across the wooden porch railing unnaturally fast. Accelerant. Someone had soaked the building. Claire! She rushed downstairs just as flames climbed the outer walls. Oh God! The fire spread instantly across the dry cedar siding. Heat slammed into the front room while smoke poured through the broken window gaps. Garrett grabbed blankets and beat back sparks near the doorway. Get outside. Claire grabbed medical bags and journals from the counter while Atlas barked furiously at the flames. The old apothecary groaned beneath the sudden heat. Outside, blizzard winds fed the fire harder. Flames rolled across the porch ceiling and shattered the remaining windows. Garrett turned toward the hidden cabinet. The bunker, the letters, the tapes. Everything Elias protected for decades. Smoke thickened fast. Garrett! Claire shouted. But he was already moving. He wrapped his coat over his face and ran toward the cabinet. Atlas followed immediately. No! Garrett yelled. The shepherd ignored him completely. Garrett opened the hidden panel and descended into the bunker while smoke followed overhead. The underground room remained untouched so far. He grabbed armfuls of journals, photographs, cassette tapes, stuffing them into canvas bags as fast as possible. Then he heard Claire screaming upstairs and Atlas barking wildly. Garrett sprinted back toward the staircase. Smoke now filled the entire apothecary. The ceiling above the front counter burned bright orange. A support beam crashed onto the floor. Claire stood near the entrance, coughing violently while trying to drag supply crates outside. But Atlas had disappeared back toward the upstairs apartment. Garrett's blood turned cold instantly. Atlas. No answer. Only fire roaring through the building. Garrett ran toward the staircase through choking smoke. The second floor glowed with flames spreading along the hallway ceiling. Atlas. Then he saw him. The old shepherd emerged through smoke, carrying Garrett's battered military photo box gently in his jaws. The same box Garrett had carried through every town since losing Nora. Atlas staggered toward him through falling embers. Another beam cracked overhead. Garrett grabbed the dog and the box together. Come on! The staircase behind them collapsed seconds after they reached the first floor. Heat exploded through the room. Garrett shoved Claire through the front doorway into the snow, while carrying Atlas against his chest. All three collapsed into the freezing street as flames consumed the upper windows behind them. The apothecary burned against the storm-dark mountains like a torch in the snow, and Atlas lay trembling in Garrett's arms, smoke-blackened and exhausted, still holding the photo box he refused to abandon. Snow melted against the dog's burned fur while flames roared behind them. The old apothecary blazed against the frozen Montana night like a funeral pyre. Firelight reflected across the drifting snow and the dark windows of nearby buildings, while townspeople began emerging from homes farther down Main Street. Someone shouted for water. Another voice yelled to call the volunteer fire department. But Garrett barely heard any of it. He knelt in the snow, holding Atlas tightly, while the old shepherd struggled for breath against his chest. "You stupid old bastard," Garrett whispered hoarsely. "Why'd you go back in there?" Atlas weakly nudged the metal photo box toward Garrett's hand. Even now, still protecting him, Claire dropped beside them immediately, coughing hard from smoke inhalation. Her cheeks were streaked black with soot and melting snow. "Let me see him." Garrett carefully lowered Atlas onto a wool blanket spread across the street, while Claire examined the burns along the dog's side and paws. "He inhaled smoke," she said quietly. "But he's alive." Garrett exhaled shakily for the first time in several minutes. Sirens echoed faintly through the valley. Volunteer firefighters arrived in old county trucks moments later, but Garrett already knew the truth before the hoses came out. The upper floor was gone. Flames punched through the roof while smoke billowed into the snowy sky. The apothecary was dying. And somewhere beneath the burning structure sat the hidden bunker Elias Granger had protected for decades. Garrett's stomach tightened instantly. "The journals." He stood suddenly. Claire grabbed his arm. "Garrett, no. The bunker's still down there. The building's collapsing." He looked back toward the flames. Part of the first floor still stood. Maybe the underground room survived. Maybe. Atlas tried to rise beside him. "No." Garrett knelt quickly again. "You stay," the old shepherd whined angrily. Even injured, Atlas still wanted to follow him back into danger. Garrett pressed his forehead briefly against the dog's. "Stay with Claire." Then he turned and ran back toward the burning apothecary. "Garrett!" Claire screamed after him. The heat slammed into him instantly. Smoke rolled through the shattered entrance, while burning beams cracked overhead. Firefighters shouted warnings behind him, but Garrett pushed deeper into the smoke-filled room toward the hidden cabinet. The walnut shelves burned fiercely now. Flames climbed the walls around the hidden entrance. Garrett wrapped his coat around his mouth and forced the cabinet panel open again. The steel bunker door remained intact. Thank God. He descended quickly underground. The bunker below remained mostly untouched by fire, though smoke had begun drifting down the staircase. Garrett grabbed every journal, cassette tape, photograph, and letter bundle he could carry. Canvas sacks, military crates, anything. He worked desperately through the smoke, shoving Elias's history into bags while the building above groaned like a dying ship. Then something caught his eye. One final cassette tape resting alone atop the desk, different from the others, labeled simply, "Final Recording, Elias Granger, October 1971. Garrett froze. The fire thundered above him. But somehow, he knew this mattered more than anything else in the room. He grabbed the tape, then ran. The second he reached the main floor, part of the ceiling collapsed behind him, in an explosion of sparks and burning wood. Garrett stumbled through smoke, carrying the canvas bags against his chest before crashing out into the freezing street. Firefighters dragged him farther from the building, as another section of roof collapsed inward. Claire ran toward him immediately. "You idiot!" But relief flooded her face when she saw the journals. Garrett collapsed onto the snow beside Atlas, coughing violently while smoke poured from the apothecary behind them. The old shepherd crawled weakly toward him anyway, still checking on him first. Garrett wrapped one arm around Atlas's neck while trying to catch his breath. The fire burned until nearly dawn. By sunrise, Black Hollow Apothecary stood blackened and broken beneath pale winter light. Half the roof had collapsed. The upstairs apartment was gone entirely, but the stone foundation remained, and beneath it, the bunker survived. Townspeople so gathered silently along the street that morning, while smoke drifted upward into gray skies. Some offered blankets, coffee, supplies. Garrett barely noticed any of them. He sat on the tailgate of his truck beside Atlas, staring at the ruined building while exhaustion hollowed him out from the inside. Claire approached, carrying steaming coffee cups. "You need to rest." Garrett accepted the cup quietly. So does he. Atlas lay wrapped beneath heavy blankets in the truck bed. Fresh bandages covered the burns along his paws and shoulder. Still alive, barely. Claire sat beside Garrett in silence for several moments. Then she looked toward the surviving canvas bags stacked near the truck. "What's on that tape?" Garrett reached into his coat pocket slowly. The final recording. Smoke-stained but intact. I think we're about to find out. By afternoon, Eleanor Pike reopened an empty storage room beside the municipal office so Garrett and Claire could sort through the salvaged materials from the bunker. The room smelled faintly of dust and old paper. Garrett sat beside a small cassette player while Atlas rested near the heater. Claire lowered herself carefully into the chair across from him. You ready? No. Garrett would never be ready for any of this. But he pressed play anyway. Static crackled softly through the speaker. Then Elias Granger's voice filled the room. Older now, tired, deliberate. If you are listening to this recording, then it means the room has finally been opened. Garrett felt every muscle tighten. Elias continued. My name is Elias Granger. Today is October 14th, 1971. I am recording this because I believe my time here is ending soon. The tape hissed softly. Outside, train wheels groaned somewhere beyond town. I built the bunker because too many soldiers were dying after they came home. Not in combat. Afterward. Claire lowered her eyes. Garrett stared motionless at the recorder. The government called it shell shock once, then battle fatigue, then operational stress. Elias gave a bitter laugh. Different names for the same ghosts. The tape crackled again. Men came to Black Hollow because nobody asked questions here. Ranchers minded their own business. Mountains gave people room to breathe. Garrett glanced toward Atlas. The shepherd watched him carefully from beneath the blankets. Then Elias's voice softened. Daniel Boone came here in February of 1970. Garrett stopped breathing. He saved my life outside Kasan 2 years earlier. Pulled me through mortar fire after my leg was hit. Claire looked toward Garrett slowly. The tape continued. Daniel carried storms inside him same as the rest of us, but he hid them better. Garrett stared at the cassette player like it might explode. He told me he had a son. Elias paused, said the boy loved mountains. Said he prayed the kid would never understand war. Garrett closed his eyes briefly. His father's voice had almost vanished from memory over the years. Now suddenly everything felt close again, alive again. Then Elias said the words that shattered what remained of Garrett's emotional armor. Before Daniel left Black Hollow, he asked me for one promise. Static crackled. He said, if my son ever comes home broken like we did, help him survive it. Garrett's hands trembled violently now. Claire quietly reached across the table and rested her hand over his. He barely noticed. I told Daniel I would try, Elias continued softly. So if you are hearing this now, Garrett Boone, then I suppose both of us kept our promises after all. Silence filled the room. Even the train noise outside seemed to disappear. Garrett stared downward while tears finally broke free after years of being buried beneath anger and survival. Not loud, not dramatic, just silent grief escaping at last. Atlas slowly limped across the room despite his injuries and rested his head against Garrett's knee. The old shepherd stayed there quietly while Garrett cried for the first time since Nora's funeral. And somewhere deep beneath the grief and smoke and years of war, something inside Garrett Boone finally began to heal. Not quickly, not cleanly. Healing never worked that way for men like Garrett. It came in small, quiet moments. A full breath after years of panic. A night without waking up reaching for a rifle. A conversation that didn't feel like pretending. And sometimes it came through an old dog resting his head against your knee while you cried in a dusty municipal storage room in a forgotten Montana town. Snow continued falling softly outside Black Hollow through the rest of the afternoon. Claire stayed beside Garrett without speaking much. She understood enough to know silence could be mercy for veterans carrying too many ghosts. Atlas slept heavily near the heater after the exhausting night. Fresh bandages wrapped his burned paws and shoulder while his breathing finally steadied into deep, tired rhythms. Garrett looked older now, not weaker, just emptied out. The fire had taken almost everything again, and somehow it had also given something back. Eleanor Pike arrived near dusk, carrying a cardboard tray of coffee and sandwiches donated by half the town. "You've become local gossip already," she muttered while setting the food down. Garrett managed a faint smile. "Always wanted that." Eleanor looked toward the burned journals stacked carefully on tables around the room, then toward Atlas sleeping beside the heater. "Word travels fast in small towns," she said quietly, "especially when a man runs into a burning building for old letters and a dog nearly dies dragging him back out." Garrett looked down at the final cassette tape, still resting near the recorder. "He saved my life again." Eleanor followed his gaze toward Atlas. "Some dogs are smarter than people." She shrugged. "Not a high bar, admittedly." Claire laughed softly for the first time all day. The sound warmed the room. Outside, headlights rolled slowly past the municipal building windows, then stopped. Garrett immediately noticed. Combat instincts never truly rested. A black SUV sat idling across the street beneath falling snow, tinted windows, expensive, out of place in Black Hollow. Eleanor noticed too, Curtis Vane. Garrett's jaw tightened. The SUV remained there for nearly a minute before finally driving away, watching. Always watching. "He won't stop," Eleanor said quietly. Garrett looked back toward the salvaged journals. "Neither will I." The next morning dawned bitter cold. The fire had left the apothecary blackened and skeletal beneath pale gray skies. Smoke still drifted faintly from the collapsed roof, while frost coated the surviving stone walls. Garrett stood in the snow, staring at the ruins beside Atlas. The old shepherd limped heavily now. Too heavily. Claire joined them, carrying fresh coffee. "You shouldn't be standing out here long," she told Atlas gently. The dog ignored her completely, still guarding, still watching the remains of the apothecary. Garrett looked toward the mountains beyond town. White peaks stretched endlessly beneath winter clouds, while pine forests disappeared into deep valleys filled with drifting fog. Beautiful country. Lonely country. The kind of place broken men disappeared into, or rebuilt themselves inside. Claire stood beside him quietly. "What are you going to do?" Garrett answered without hesitation this time. "Rebuild it." Claire blinked once. "The whole place?" "Ilias kept it alive for 50 years. Garrett looked toward the bunker hidden beneath the ruins. "Seems wrong to let it die now." The wind moved softly through the burned beams. Claire studied him carefully. A week earlier, Garrett Boone looked like a man waiting for life to finish with him. Now there was purpose in his eyes again. Dangerous purpose, maybe, but purpose. "You know the town's going to think you're insane." Garrett sipped coffee slowly. "Wouldn't be the first time." By afternoon, the rebuilding began. Not officially. Not with permits or contractors. Just quietly. The way mountain towns handled most things. A rancher named Wade Mercer arrived first with lumber strapped to a flatbed trailer. "Figured you might need this," he said simply. Then came 2 retired railroad workers carrying tools. Then an elderly widower with spare windows from an old hunting cabin. Nobody made speeches. Nobody asked many questions. They simply started helping. Garrett noticed something else, too. Most of them were veterans: Vietnam, Korea, Iraq, Afghanistan. Men with stiff shoulders and quiet eyes. Men who recognized each other without introductions. Atlas lay near the worksite beneath blankets, while the men repaired temporary supports around the surviving foundation walls. One older Marine named Leonard Briggs stopped beside the dog and crouched slowly despite bad knees. "That Shepherd military?" Garrett nodded. "SEAL Team K9. Leonard scratched gently behind Atlas's ears. "My shepherd pulled me out of a rice ditch outside Da Nang in '68. He smiled faintly. "Best friend I ever had." Atlas leaned weakly against his hand. Garrett watched silently. Throughout the day, more veterans drifted toward the ruins. Some helped carry lumber. Others simply stood nearby, watching the work quietly, like they were trying to decide whether they belonged there. By sunset, a fire barrel burned near the street while coffee brewed beside stacks of salvaged journals and medical supplies. The ruins of the apothecary no longer looked abandoned. They looked occupied, alive again. That evening, Garrett unlocked the bunker beneath the damaged building for the first time since the fire. Several veterans followed him underground carefully. The hidden room glowed warm beneath temporary lanterns, while rows of letters and photographs lined the walls around them. No one spoke for several seconds. Then Leonard Briggs whispered softly, "Jesus." Another man removed his hat slowly, while staring at the photographs of soldiers across decades. A truck driver named Carl Jensen picked up one of the letters with trembling hands. "He kept all these," Garrett nodded. "He listened to men nobody else wanted to hear." Silence filled the bunker again. Heavy silence. The kind soldiers understood. Carl carefully set the letter back down. "My wife says I sleep with my fists closed." He laughed bitterly. "Been 40 years since Vietnam, and apparently I still punch walls in my dreams." Nobody mocked him. Nobody looked uncomfortable. Because half the room understood exactly what he meant. Leonard lowered himself heavily into a chair beside the desk. "I haven't talked about Da Nang since Nixon was president." Garrett looked around slowly and realized something important. The bunker was working again. Not because of medicine, not because of journals, because wounded men finally felt safe enough to stop pretending. Atlas limped carefully into the center of the room. The veterans watched him quietly as the old shepherd moved from one man to another, accepting gentle touches and tired smiles. One retired rancher with severe tremors in his hands suddenly stopped shaking while rubbing Atlas's neck. He noticed too. "So that's what peace feels like," he whispered. Claire stood beside Garrett watching all of it unfold. "You rebuilt it already," she said softly. Garrett frowned slightly. "The building's still half gone." Claire looked around the bunker. "No," she answered quietly. "This is what Elias was protecting." Late that night, after everyone finally left, Garrett sat alone beside the bunker desk listening to the wind above. Atlas slept nearby beneath blankets. The old dog's breathing sounded rougher now. Age was winning slowly. Garrett knew it. He hated it anyway. He reached down and rested one hand gently against Atlas's side. "You kept me alive long enough to find this place." Atlas opened one tired eye briefly. Then Garrett looked toward the wall of photographs again. His father, Elias. The broken veterans stretching across 50 years. And for the first time since returning from Afghanistan, Garrett Boone no longer felt alone inside the war. Outside, snow drifted softly across Black Hollow, while warm lantern light glowed beneath the ruined apothecary. Travelers passing through town that night slowed when they saw the light beneath the broken building. Some stopped, some stayed. And deep beneath the Montana mountains, hidden beneath burned wood and old grief, the sanctuary Elias Granger built for forgotten soldiers quietly came back to life. Winter slowly loosened its grip on Black Hollow after that, not all at once. Montana never surrendered cold weather easily. Snow still covered the high ridges through April, and icy winds continued sweeping through the valley at night. But little by little, signs of spring began appearing around town. Icicles disappeared from porch roofs. The railroad yard thawed. Mud replaced packed snow along Main Street. And every morning before sunrise, lights glowed again beneath the ruins of the old apothecary. Garrett rebuilt the place with his own hands. Not because it was easy, because it mattered. The town helped quietly. Wade Mercer hauled reclaimed timber down from his ranch outside the valley. Leonard Briggs rebuilt the staircase, despite arthritic hands that shook whenever the weather changed. Retired railroad workers repaired the furnace pipes. Claire organized donated medical supplies in the surviving dispensary room. Nobody asked for money. Nobody asked for recognition. The veterans simply kept showing up, and Atlas watched all of it from a blanket beside the worksite. The old shepherd had slowed noticeably since the fire. His muzzle had gone almost completely white now. Some mornings it took him longer to stand. His burned paws healed slowly despite Claire's careful treatment. But every single day, Atlas limped through the construction site, checking on everyone like he still believed the entire mission depended on him. Which, in a strange way, it did. The men trusted the dog before they trusted each other. A retired Marine, who hadn't spoken more than 3 sentences in months, began sitting beside Atlas every afternoon. A former truck driver with panic attacks stopped shaking whenever the shepherd rested his head on his knee. One widower named Samuel Reese broke down crying one evening while brushing Atlas's fur near the stove. "I haven't touched another living thing since my wife died," he whispered. Nobody mocked him. Nobody looked away. The sanctuary worked because nobody had to pretend there. By late summer, the apothecary stood again. Not fully restored, better. The burned sections had been rebuilt with darker mountain pine that contrasted against the original stone foundation. Warm lanterns glowed through the front windows at night, while shelves inside slowly filled once more with herbs, journals, medicine jars, and photographs saved from the fire. The hidden bunker remained untouched beneath it all, protected, sacred. Garrett converted the upstairs apartment into a small living space overlooking the valley. The old iron stove still sat beside the window now, crackling softly during cold evenings while Atlas slept nearby. For the first time in 20 years, Garrett unpacked his boxes completely. No more drifting. No more truck stops. No more waking up already planning where to run next. One September evening, nearly a year after arriving in Black Hollow, Garrett stood alone outside the rebuilt apothecary watching sunset spill across the mountains. The sky burned deep orange behind the pine ridges, while cold air carried the smell of cedar and chimney smoke through town. Inside the building, voices drifted softly through the open windows, veterans talking, laughing occasionally. Living, Garrett still wasn't used to hearing that sound. Claire stepped onto the porch beside him, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. "You missed dinner again." Garrett accepted the mug. "I was finishing the sign." Claire smiled slightly. "Eleanor says you've become impossible to argue with. She says that because she keeps losing. That woman hasn't lost an argument since the Nixon administration." Garrett laughed quietly. A real laugh this time, not forced, not borrowed. Claire leaned against the porch railing beside him. Below them, Black Hollow glowed warmly beneath gathering dusk. The railroad crossing lights blinked red near the tracks, while children rode bicycles down Main Street and pickup trucks rolled slowly home from the ranch roads. The town no longer felt dead, not entirely. Claire looked toward Garrett carefully. "You staying?" He glanced at her. "You asking professionally or personally?" "Both." Garrett looked back toward the mountains. A year earlier, he planned to die quietly somewhere nobody would notice. Now there were men downstairs depending on him. Letters waiting to be answered. Stories still buried inside soldiers, too ashamed to speak them aloud. And there was Claire. And Atlas, always Atlas. The old shepherd slowly pushed through the apothecary door and limped onto the porch beside them. His hips shook slightly now when he walked too far, but his eyes remained calm and watchful beneath the lantern light. Garrett crouched carefully beside him. "You supervising again?" Atlas rested heavily against his chest. Claire watched them silently. "You know," she said softly, "half the town thinks that dog led you here on purpose." Garrett scratched gently behind Atlas's ears. "Sometimes I think so too." The lantern above the porch flickered warmly against the darkening street. Garrett looked up toward the new wooden sign hanging above the entrance. Fresh paint, clean lettering, simple. Boone and Atlas Mountain, Apothecary and Veterans House. The words stirred something deep inside him. Not pride exactly, Purpose. The thing Elias Granger protected all those years. The thing Daniel Boone prayed his son might someday find after war tried to hollow him out. A place to keep surviving men alive, long enough to become human again. Inside the apothecary, Leonard Briggs called out from downstairs. "Boone, you planning on drinking that coffee or admiring it all night?" Laughter followed. Garrett smiled faintly. Coming, he started toward the door, then paused. The mountain wind moved softly through Black Hollow while darkness settled across the valley below. Warm light spilled from the apothecary windows onto the sidewalk. Where snow had once covered everything the night, Garrett arrived, with $1 and nowhere left to go. Travelers passing through town slowed now when they saw the building glowing against the mountains. Some came inside for coffee, some for medicine, some because they carried invisible wounds they could no longer survive alone with. The sanctuary kept growing quietly, just like Elias intended. Garrett rested one hand against Atlas's neck before guiding the old shepherd gently inside. The apothecary smelled alive now. Coffee, wood smoke, herbs drying near the windows, and beneath it all, peace. Atlas crossed slowly toward the rebuilt walnut cabinet and lowered himself onto the rug beneath it with a tired grunt. Same place he chose the very first night, guarding the hidden room, guarding Garrett, still watching. Garrett looked around at the veterans gathered near the stove, sharing stories beneath warm lantern light. Men who had spent decades isolated inside their own memories now sitting shoulder to shoulder in quiet understanding. No uniforms, no ranks, just survivors. Claire caught Garrett's eye from across the room. He smiled back automatically and realized something strange. The constant pressure inside his chest was gone, not hidden, gone. Outside, snow began falling lightly again over Black Hollow. Winter returning to the Montana mountains. But this time, the light inside the apothecary stayed warm against the darkness. And for the first time in 20 years, Garrett Boone stopped surviving and finally began living. If this story meant something to you, type "still standing" down in the comments. A lot of good people carry battles nobody else can see. And sometimes all it takes is one loyal soul to bring a person back home. And if you believe in stories about grit, loyalty, second chances, and standing your ground in the land you love, subscribe and come ride with us on the next one.